January 1943. The world rests on a frozen razor's edge, and that edge is a city in ruins on the banks of the Volga. This is not Stalingrad. This is hell, solidified by the Russian winter, a labyrinth of skeletal buildings, of shattered chimneys pointing to the gray sky like accusing fingers, and of streets that are no longer streets, but trenches carved from filthy snow and rubble. The very air is an enemy. It burns the lungs with every breath, freezes exposed skin in minutes, and turns the steel of a rifle into a block of ice that is painful to the touch. The temperature has plunged to 30 degrees below zero, a cold so deep and penetrating it seems to swallow sound, creating an unnatural silence broken only by the wind howling through the ruins and the distant, almost constant, rumble of artillery. For the soldier Hans, huddled in the cellar of what was once a bakery, the routine is a litany of misery. Dawn brings no light, only a shift from black to gray. The first thought of the day is not of victory, nor of home, not even of survival. It is hunger, a hunger that goes beyond an empty stomach. It is a corrosive pain that gnaws at the muscles, clouds the mind, and turns comrades into specters with sunken eyes. It has been weeks since they ate the last of the horses. Their bones, boiled over and over, until not a shred of substance remains, lie scattered in the cellars. Then came the dogs, then the rats. Now, there is only the silence of starvation, punctuated by dark rumors, whispers of unthinkable acts committed in the most absolute desperation. Ammunition is almost a memory. Every bullet is counted, saved for the final moment. General Paulus has ordered shells to be conserved. But for what? The Panzer tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, are now frozen steel coffins, immobilized by a lack of fuel. Their cannons point uselessly toward an enemy that closes in, as inexorable as an ice age. But the worst place is not the front line. It is the makeshift hospital in the adjoining cellar. There lie thousands of wounded, young men with limbs amputated by frostbite, with wounds infected by gangrene, covered by rags instead of bandages. There is no morphine, no medicine, no warmth. The doctor, a man of 50, whose face is a mask of exhaustion, can only offer a word of comfort before death arrives. The stench of disease and despair clings to the frozen air. The last hope vanished a few days ago. On January 24th, the Potomnik airfield fell. Then Gumrak, Hermann Göring's grand promise, the air bridge that would keep the Sixth Army alive, has evaporated. The last plane took off, carrying a few lucky souls and leaving behind 250,000 condemned men. The Kessel, the cauldron, has been hermetically sealed. Now, Soviet forces have sliced the pocket in two. To the north, near the factory district, General Strecker and his men hold out in an ever-shrinking pocket of territory. To the south, in the ruined city center, Paulus himself and his staff are trapped. The army is no longer a fighting force. It is a mass of dying men, an organism disintegrating cell by cell, hour by hour, in the heart of a merciless winter. The abyss is not near. They have already fallen into it. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must go back a few months, to November 1942. While Paulus's soldiers fought street by street in the urban hell of Stalingrad, a cold and calculating mind was drawing lines on a map hundreds of kilometers away. That mind belonged to Georgy Zhukov, the general Stalin had summoned to save the Soviet Union. Zhukov was not a man of grand speeches or magnetic charisma. He was the embodiment of the Soviet iron will, a brilliant and utterly ruthless strategist. His plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was not subtle. It was a sledgehammer blow, a masterpiece of grand-scale military strategy. He saw the weakness that the Germans, in their arrogance, had ignored. The mighty Sixth Army was the spearhead, but its flanks, stretched over hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, were held by poorly equipped and demoralized Romanian and Italian troops. Zhukov saw them not as an Axis ally, but as a crack in the armor. On November 19th, the storm broke. 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and guns, smashed into those vulnerable flanks. The defenses disintegrated in a matter of hours. While Paulus remained obsessed with taking the last few meters of Stalingrad, 2 massive pincers drove across the frozen steppe, one from the north and one from the south. 4 days later, in the small town of Kalach, the spearheads of the Soviet T-34 tanks met. The encirclement was complete. 300,000 men of the 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army were trapped. The hunter had become the hunted. The subsequent operation, named Operation Ring, was even simpler and more brutal, to contract the encirclement and methodically annihilate everything inside. On the other side of the equation, at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in eastern Prussia, Adolf Hitler lived in a parallel reality. For him, maps did not represent men of flesh and blood, but symbols of National Socialist will. The 6th Army was not a collection of trapped divisions. It was Fortress Stalingrad, an unbreachable bastion. When his generals begged him to allow Paulus to attempt a breakout, Hitler became enraged. The word surrender was erased from the vocabulary. He forbade any attempt at withdrawal, blindly believing the empty, arrogant promise of the Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring, who assured him he could supply the army by air. 500 tons of supplies daily, he promised. A logistical fantasy that never came close to reality. Hitler saw the sacrifice of the 6th Army not as a defeat, but as a supreme act of heroism that would inspire the German nation for centuries. They were pawns on his cosmic chessboard, a blood offering to the gods of war. His disconnection from the reality on the ground was total, absolute. While his soldiers froze and starved, he moved ghost divisions on a map, convinced that sheer force of will could defy logic, winter, and the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority. Friedrich Paulus, the man caught in the middle, was a product of this system, a meticulous staff officer, brilliant at planning, but lacking the audacity and insubordination needed to defy a suicidal order. He was an executor, not a leader. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute, a blind obedience that had become his own death sentence and that of his men. His health deteriorated along with his army. He suffered from dysentery, and a nervous tic constantly shook his face, a physical manifestation of the war raging within his soul. He was paralyzed, trapped between the duty to obey his Führer and the horrifying reality of the annihilation he saw all around him. Every report from his commanders was a dagger, every radio message from high command, another nail in his army's coffin. On January 8, 1943, a strange calm descended over the front. From the Soviet lines, officers emerged under white flags. They carried an ultimatum from General Konstantin Rokossovsky, the commander tasked with executing the final phase of the annihilation. The offer was surprisingly honorable. Rokossovsky promised full rations, medical care for the wounded and sick, and a guarantee that all prisoners would be repatriated to Germany or any country they wished after the war. It was one last escape hatch, a chance to save the tens of thousands of men who could still be saved. In Paulus's bunker, the document was translated and discussed. For his staff officers, the choice was obvious. The fight had lost all military meaning. To continue meant only to multiply death and suffering. But the final decision was not theirs. It was Paulus's. And Paulus's mind was chained to an order issued hundreds of kilometers away. Hitler's order was unequivocal. Surrender is out of the question. The 6th Army must hold out to the last man and the last bullet. Paulus, the meticulous staff officer, could not break his oath. He sent multiple, desperate radio messages to the Führer's headquarters, describing the hopeless situation, pleading for what he called freedom of action. It was a euphemism, a code for permission to surrender or attempt a breakout. Hitler's reply was always the same: a flat no, a reminder of his duty, a demand for sacrifice. Paulus, tortured by indecision, obeyed. He formally rejected Rokossovsky's ultimatum. The escape hatch slammed shut, and with that act, he sealed his army's fate. The next 3 weeks were a needless agony, a descent into the deepest circles of hell. On the night of January 30th, with Soviet troops already fighting in the city center, a final radio message arrived from Berlin. It contained no orders, no promises of aid. It contained a promotion. Hitler had elevated Friedrich Paulus to the rank of field marshal. It was not an honor. It was an act of sublime psychological cruelty. It was a coded message, an implicit order. History recorded that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was a loaded pistol, a direct invitation to suicide. Fight to the death or take your own life, but do not stain the honor of the officer corps with the shame of capture. It was at that moment, in the damp cold of his cellar, that something inside Paulus finally broke. Blind loyalty transformed into bitter resignation. He looked at his staff, the tick in his face more pronounced than ever, and remarked with grim sarcasm that he had no intention of shooting himself for that Bohemian corporal. Hitler's cruelty, designed to force a heroic end, had the opposite effect. It annihilated the last shred of Paulus's will to immolate himself for a cause he now saw as empty and treacherous. It was the moment that sealed the fate of 100,000 souls. And it is the final assault, the storm of steel that followed this decision, that we will analyze in unprecedented detail. Before we unleash hell on Stalingrad, if you value this journey into the depths of history, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us continue to bring these chronicles from the abyss. Now, back to the Kessel, where time has run out. On January 10th, 2 days after the ultimatum was rejected, the sky over Stalingrad was torn apart. 7,000 Soviet cannons and mortars opened fire simultaneously. It was a hurricane of steel, a bombardment of an intensity few had ever experienced. The ground shook, and the air filled with the deafening roar of explosions and the smell of cordite. For the German soldiers in the western trenches of the Kessel, it was the beginning of the end. Huddled in their frozen foxholes, they could only wait as the earth around them was pulverized. The Soviet artillery did not aim for specific targets. It erased entire sections of the map. When the bombardment ceased, the silence was almost as terrifying as the noise. Out of the mist and smoke emerged the silhouettes of T-34 tanks, followed by waves of white-clad Soviet infantry, almost invisible against the snow. The Germans, weakened by hunger and cold, offered sporadic resistance. A sergeant named Kurt, with an MG-42 machine gun, managed to fire a few bursts before his frozen weapon jammed. He watched as the tanks rolled over his position without even stopping. Within a week, the western defenses of the pocket had completely disintegrated. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The Kessel shrank dramatically, forcing the survivors back into the ruins of the city, into an increasingly congested and desperate pocket of resistance. On January 24th, the Soviet offensive reached a new peak of intensity. Rokossovsky's armies launched a massive assault from the west and east simultaneously, aiming to split the Kessel in two. The German resistance, already a disorganized chaos, began to collapse on a massive scale. There was no longer a coherent front, only isolated groups of men fighting for their own survival. In a cellar near Red Square, a military doctor named Werner was trying to save a young soldier whose leg had been shattered by a mortar shell. He had no anesthetic, only a swig of vodka and a piece of wood for the boy to bite on. As he operated with a kitchen knife sterilized in a flame, the walls trembled from nearby explosions. He knew it was futile. Even if the soldier survived the operation, he would die of infection or starvation within days. Outside, the Soviet tactic was brutally simple. Massed artillery obliterated any building or strongpoint that offered resistance. Then the tanks moved in to finish off the rubble, followed by infantry who cleared out the cellars and tunnels. There was no subtlety, only the methodical application of overwhelming force against a dying enemy. The German tactic, if it could be called that, was simply to find deeper cover and pray to survive another hour. On January 31st, the drama reached its climax. Units of the Soviet 62nd Army, which had defended Stalingrad for months, finally advanced from the east and met Rokossovsky's forces coming from the west. They had reached the heart of the city and surrounded Red Square. Their final objective was a large, ruined building, the Univermag department store. In the basement of that building was the headquarters of the 6th Army. There, Friedrich Paulus, newly promoted to field marshal, awaited his fate. There was no heroic last stand. When Soviet officers descended the stairs, they found a tall, emaciated, sick man. The tick on his face was incessant. He was mentally and physically broken. The surrender was a surreal anticlimax. No shots fired, no final defiance, just the quiet resignation of a man who had lost his army and his soul. Paulus and his entire staff were taken prisoner. The southern pocket of Stalingrad had ceased to exist, but the battle was not yet over. A few kilometers to the north, in the devastated industrial district, General Karl Strecker and the remnants of the 18th Army Corps were still fighting. They were completely isolated, without any hope of rescue or relief. For 2 more days, they continued a senseless resistance. Strecker was a convinced Nazi, a man who clung to the ideal of sacrifice to the very end. His men, however, were at their limit. Individual surrenders multiplied. Finally, on the morning of February 2nd, Strecker realized the charade was over. He sent one last radio message to Hitler's high command. The message was a piece of propaganda to the last. It announced that the Enemy Army Corps had done its duty to the last man. It concluded with a defiant, "Long live the Führer." Moments later, he walked out of his bunker and surrendered to Soviet officers. With his capitulation, the last shot of the Battle of Stalingrad fell silent. The silence that fell over the ruined city was absolute. The capture of a German field marshal, the first in history, was not just a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake. The final breaking point for Friedrich Paulus was not the overwhelming Soviet superiority or the annihilation of his divisions. It was that last radio message from Hitler, the cruel promotion designed to drive him to suicide. That act snapped the final thread of his blind loyalty. The telephone to Hitler, the communication with high command, had become a farce. The break was not tactical, but spiritual. Paulus refused to become the martyr Hitler desired. By choosing surrender over suicide, he committed the deepest possible act of defiance against the man he had served so obediently. The news of the surrender spread like a shockwave. For the German public, it was a devastating blow. For weeks, Goebbels' propaganda machine had been feeding them stories of the Sixth Army's heroic resistance, portraying them as an unbreachable bastion of German will. They had been told victory was assured. Suddenly, the brutal, undeniable truth broke through. For the first time, the Nazi regime was forced to admit a defeat of catastrophic proportions. The government declared 3 days of national mourning. Radios stopped playing music, replacing it with somber classical compositions. But this orchestrated mourning could not hide the reality. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had been shattered. Across occupied Europe and on the battlefronts, the news had an electrifying effect. For resistance movements and allied nations, it was definitive proof that the Nazi giant could be wounded, that it was not invincible. It was a morale boost of incalculable value. For the Soviet High Command, the victory was far more than symbolic. The annihilation of the Sixth Army freed up nearly 1 million veteran Soviet soldiers. These armies did not rest. They were immediately redeployed to other sectors of the front, where their weight and experience tipped the balance in crucial battles during the spring and summer of 1943. Meanwhile, in the German High Command, Hitler's frustration and rage were volcanic. He felt personally betrayed by Paulus. How could a German field marshal choose captivity over an honorable death? In his mind, it was unforgivable cowardice. The fall of Stalingrad cost him not just an army. It cost him the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front for good. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht would be on the defensive, reacting to Soviet moves in a long and bloody retreat that would end in the ruins of Berlin. The domino effect was unstoppable. The catastrophe forced the Germans to divert crucial units from other fronts, weakening their position in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the hinge upon which the entire war turned. The psychological impact of the surrender, the image of a field marshal and 22 generals marching into captivity, resonated louder than any bombardment. When the last shot fell silent on February 2, 1943, the full scale of the disaster became apparent. Of the nearly 300,000 men of the Sixth Army and its allied units who were trapped in the Kessel in November, the Soviet victory had exacted a terrible price. The final statistics are a testament to the battle's brutality. An estimated 150,000 Axis soldiers died during the siege, victims of combat, starvation, frostbite, and disease. The army had been literally devoured by the city and the winter. 91,000 survivors, starving and frozen specters, were taken prisoner. Among them were 22 generals and the newly appointed Field Marshal Paulus. For these men, surrender was not the end of their suffering. It was the beginning of another hell, the death marches and the Soviet prison camps. Of those 91,000 men who marched into captivity, only 5,000 to 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest would perish from disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition in the following years. The Sixth Army had not just been defeated, it had been erased from existence. Stalingrad is universally recognized as the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. It was more than a simple German military defeat. It was a catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht never fully recovered. neither in terms of material nor, more importantly, of experienced manpower. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed irrevocably into the hands of the Red Army. Friedrich Paulus himself would become a tragic and controversial figure. During his captivity in the Soviet Union, he became an outspoken critic of the Nazi regime. He joined the Soviet-sponsored National Committee for a Free Germany, and his voice was used in propaganda broadcasts aimed at German troops. To many in Germany, he was a traitor. To others, a man who finally awoke to the criminal madness he had served. The name of the city, Stalingrad, became seared into the world's consciousness. It became synonymous with attritional warfare at its most savage, with military disaster brought on by hubris and ideology, and, above all, with the triumph of human will and resistance against all odds. The battle proved that a modern, technologically advanced army could be stopped and annihilated by iron determination and human sacrifice on an almost unimaginable scale. The legacy of Stalingrad is not written in stone, but in the blood-stained snow of a destroyed city, an eternal monument to the cost of pride and the brutality of total war.